The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the desert floor outside Yuma, turning the sand into a shimmering ocean of heat waves. George Lucas wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the makeshift film set that would soon become the alien world of Tatooine. It was March 1976, and his ambitious space opera was finally moving from dreams to reality. "George, we've got a problem with the moisture evaporator prop," called out Gary Kurtz, his producer, jogging across the sand with evident frustration. "The damn thing keeps sinking into the sand every time we try to secure it." Lucas nodded, his mind already working through solutions. At 29, he was young for a director of such an ambitious project, but his vision was unwavering. The desert location was perfect, otherworldly, isolated, and cheap. Everything they needed for a film that Fox executives still considered a risky venture. "Get the crew to dig a foundation pit," Lucas replied, shading his eyes as he looked toward the distant mountains. "We'll bury a platform and build up from there." As the crew began their excavation work, prop master Roger Christian approached with a confused expression. In his weathered hands, he held something that made Lucas's blood run cold. "George, you need to see this. We found it about 3 feet down while digging the foundation." It was a photograph, a Polaroid that looked relatively new despite being buried in the desert sand. The image showed the exact same location where they now stood, but the film equipment was already in place. Every prop, every camera angle, every detail was precisely as they had planned it. But that wasn't what made Lucas's hands tremble as he took the photograph. In the center of the image stood a figure that looked exactly like him. Same beard, same flannel shirt, same concerned expression he often wore during production. The figure was directing the scene, pointing toward actors dressed in the flowing robes they had designed for the Jedi characters. The man in the photograph was unmistakably George Lucas, but his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of his eyes were dark voids that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "This has to be some kind of joke," Lucas muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone from the crew must have—" "George," Roger interrupted, his voice tight with unease. "We haven't shot a single frame yet. This is our first day setting up equipment, and look at the timestamp." Lucas turned the photograph over. In the white border at the bottom, faded blue ink showed a date, March 15, 1976, today's date. But more disturbing was the timestamp, 3:47 p.m. Lucas glanced at his watch. It was 11:30 a.m. The desert wind picked up suddenly, sending spirals of sand dancing across the set. The crew members working nearby seemed oblivious to the strange discovery, their voices and the sounds of construction creating a normal backdrop to something decidedly abnormal. "Where exactly did you find this?" Lucas asked, his directorial instincts taking over despite his growing unease. "Right here," Roger pointed to a spot near the moisture evaporator foundation. It was wrapped in plastic, like someone wanted to preserve it. "But George, that's not the strangest part." Roger led him to the excavation site, where several crew members were still digging. At the bottom of the 3-foot-deep hole, partially buried in the compacted sand, were the unmistakable impressions of film equipment, tripod legs, cable tracks, and what looked like the rectangular outline of a camera dolly. "It's like someone filmed here before," Roger said quietly. "Recently. But this location has been surveyed and cleared. There's no record of any film production in this area." Lucas studied the photograph again, his mind racing through logical explanations. Could it be an elaborate prank? Had someone from Fox leaked their production plans and staged this? But the attention to detail was extraordinary. Every prop, every costume design, even the specific camera angles they had planned, were captured with perfect accuracy. "Don't mention this to the rest of the crew yet," Lucas decided, pocketing the photograph. "Let's finish setting up and see if anything else turns up." But as the day progressed, more strange details emerged. The sand patterns around their equipment matched exactly what was shown in the mysterious photograph. When they finally positioned the moisture evaporator prop, it aligned perfectly with the shadows and angles captured in the image. By late afternoon, as the desert sun began its descent toward the horizon, Lucas found himself checking his watch obsessively. 3:45 p.m., 3:46 p.m. At exactly 3:47 p.m., cinematographer Gilbert Taylor called out, "George, can you come over here and check this angle?" Without thinking, Lucas walked to the spot and turned toward the cameras, raising his hand to point at the actor positions just as he had envisioned the scene. For a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. Then he noticed the absolute silence that had fallen over the set. Every crew member was staring at him with expressions of shock and fear. Some had dropped their equipment. Others had taken involuntary steps backward. "George," Roger's voice was barely a whisper. "Your eyes." Lucas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. He looked down at the Polaroid in his hand, then back at his crew, and realized with growing horror that the photograph hadn't predicted the future. It had been waiting for him to fulfill it. The silence stretched across the desert, set like a held breath. Lucas blinked hard, trying to clear whatever was affecting his vision, but the terrified expressions on his crew's faces remained unchanged. Gary Kurtz was the first to move, stepping forward cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. "George, are you feeling all right?" Gary's voice carried the careful tone of someone trying not to provoke a dangerous situation. "What do you mean?" "I'm fine," Lucas replied, though even as he spoke, he could feel something was wrong. The world looked different somehow. Colors seemed muted, shadows appeared deeper, and there was a strange quality to the light that made everything appear slightly out of focus. Roger Christian pulled out a small mirror from his prop kit, the kind used for checking makeup and lighting. With trembling hands, he held it up toward Lucas. "George, I need you to look at yourself." Lucas took the mirror, expecting to see his familiar reflection. Instead, he found himself staring into two black voids where his eyes should be. Not just dark pupils, but complete absence, as if someone had carved holes straight through his skull into an endless night. The mirror slipped from his fingers, shattering on the rocky ground. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had fallen over the set, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. "Get him to a hospital! Call for medical assistance! What the hell is happening here?" But Lucas felt perfectly fine. Better than fine, actually. His mind was clearer than it had been in months. Every detail of the film project seemed to crystallize with perfect clarity. He could see exactly how each scene should be shot, could envision the completed movie with a vividness that surpassed his wildest dreams. "I'm not sick," he said firmly, and his voice carried an authority that made everyone stop talking. "I can see everything perfectly, better than before." And it was true. When he looked at the set, he could see beyond the physical props and equipment. He could see the story itself, as if it were already filmed and edited, playing out in translucent images overlaying reality. The characters moved through their scenes with fluid precision, and he understood instinctively how to capture every moment. George, Alec Guinness, had arrived on set for his first costume fitting, his distinguished voice cutting through the chaos. The veteran actor took in the scene with the calm assessment of someone who had seen many strange things during his long career. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." Lucas nodded, grateful for Guinness's steady presence. They walked away from the main set toward a small trailer that served as Lucas's office, leaving behind a crew buzzing with nervous energy and whispered speculation. Inside the cramped trailer, Guinness poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos and handed one to Lucas. In the dim interior lighting, Lucas's eyes appeared completely normal again, brown, alert, and focused. "Tell me what you're experiencing," Guinness said simply. Lucas hesitated, then pulled the mysterious photograph from his pocket. "We found this buried in the sand this morning. It shows me directing a scene we haven't shot yet, but with..." He gestured toward his face. Guinness examined the photograph carefully, his expression growing grave. "You know, I've encountered something similar before during my theatre days in London. There was a production of Macbeth, cursed play, they say, where strange photographs appeared showing scenes from our performances before we'd ever rehearsed them. What happened? The play consumed everyone involved. The actors began living their roles even when off stage. The director..." Guinness paused, studying Lucas's face intently. "He disappeared entirely. We found him 3 days later, wandering the Thames embankment, speaking only in iambic pentameter. He never recovered." Lucas set down his coffee cup, his hand surprisingly steady. "This is different. I'm not losing my mind. I'm seeing the story more clearly than ever before." "That's exactly what frightens me," Guinness replied quietly. "You see, the director claimed the same thing. He said he could see the play as Shakespeare had originally envisioned it, that he was channeling the true spirit of the work." Through the trailer window, they could see the crew continuing their work, though many kept glancing nervously in their direction. The desert sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sand that seemed to move independently of their sources. "There's something else," Lucas admitted. "When I look at the set now, I can see things that aren't there yet. Scenes we haven't filmed, characters in full costume. It's like watching a movie that exists somewhere else." Guinness leaned forward, his expression intense. "George, I want you to listen to me very carefully. The photograph shows you at 3:47 p.m. today. What time is it now? Lucas checked his watch. 6:23 p.m. And your eyes appear normal now? Lucas nodded. Then whatever is happening seems to be triggered by specific conditions, perhaps tied to the filming itself or certain times of day. Guinness stood up, pacing the small trailer. We need to be very careful about how we proceed. Outside, they heard Roger Christian calling for Lucas. His voice carried an urgency that made both men step quickly from the trailer. "George, you need to see this," Roger said, gesturing toward the main camera position. "We were testing the equipment for tomorrow's shoot, and..." They followed Roger to where the camera operator was reviewing footage on a small monitor. The test shots showed the empty desert set, with props positioned for the next day's filming. But in every frame, translucent figures moved through the scene, actors in Jedi robes, droids rolling across the sand, and in the center of it all, a figure that looked exactly like George Lucas, directing with confident gestures. The figure's eyes were pitch-black voids that seemed to stare directly into the camera. "We shot this 10 minutes ago," the camera operator said, his voice shaking. There was nobody on the set. Lucas stared at the monitor, watching his ghostly double conduct a scene that existed only in his imagination. As he watched, the figure on screen turned to look directly at him through the monitor, raised one hand, and pointed straight at the real Lucas. At that moment, every piece of electronic equipment on the set died simultaneously, plunging them into the gathering darkness of the desert night. The desert darkness was absolute. Without the set lights and equipment, the cast and crew found themselves surrounded by a blackness so complete it seemed solid. Emergency flashlights cut weak beams through the night, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on everyone's already frayed nerves. "Everyone stay calm," Gary Kurtz called out, though his own voice betrayed his unease. "It's probably just a power surge from the generators. We'll have everything back online in a few minutes." But 20 minutes later, despite the best efforts of the electrical crew, nothing responded. Every camera, every light, every piece of electronic equipment remained dead. Even the digital watches had stopped working, their displays blank and lifeless. "It's like an electromagnetic pulse," muttered the head electrician Chuck as he examined the main power distribution panel with a flashlight. "But I've never seen anything affect battery-powered devices like this." Lucas stood apart from the group, staring out into the desert. With his normal vision restored, he could no longer see the ghostly scenes that had been playing out across the set, but he could feel something watching them from the darkness beyond their circle of flashlight beams. "George," Alec Guinness approached quietly, "I think we should consider shutting down production until we understand what's happening here." "We can't," Lucas replied immediately. "We're already behind schedule and over budget. Fox is looking for any excuse to pull the plug on this project. And if someone gets hurt, or worse..." Lucas turned to face Guinness, and even in the dim light, the older actor could see something had changed in the young director's eyes. Not the black voids from earlier, but an intensity that seemed almost feverish. "Nothing's going to happen," Lucas said with absolute certainty. "This is exactly what the story needs. Don't you see? We're not just making a movie about the Force, we're experiencing it." Before Guinness could respond, a scream pierced the desert night. The crew rushed toward the sound, flashlight beams converging on the main set area. They found one of the assistant camera operators, Jenny Martinez, standing frozen near the moisture evaporator prop, her flashlight beam fixed on something in the sand. "There," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look at the sand." In the beam of her flashlight, footprints were appearing in the sand as they watched, not being made by any visible presence but materializing as if an invisible person were walking across the set. The prints were human, wearing what appeared to be soft-soled boots or sandals. The ghostly footprints traced a path from the main camera position to where the actors' marks had been set for tomorrow's filming. There they stopped, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then Jenny's flashlight began to flicker, its beam growing dimmer and more erratic. In the failing light, a translucent figure began to materialize where the footprints ended, a tall person wearing flowing robes, face hidden beneath a deep hood. "Jesus Christ," Chuck breathed, taking an involuntary step backward. The figure raised its head, and where a face should be, there was only darkness. Not the emptiness of shadow, but an active darkness that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. The figure turned slowly, as if surveying the assembled crew, then raised one arm and pointed directly at Lucas. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely in the open desert air. The story chooses its vessel. The vessel does not choose the story. Several crew members broke and ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they stumbled through the sand toward the distant vehicles. But Lucas found himself walking forward, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't resist. "George, no!" Gary Kurtz grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but Lucas shook him off with surprising strength. "It's trying to tell me something important." As he approached the ghostly figure, Lucas could feel the temperature dropping dramatically. His breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the nearby props despite the desert location. The hooded figure lowered its pointing arm and reached into its robes, withdrawing what appeared to be another photograph. It held the image out toward Lucas, who took it despite the burning cold that shot through his fingers at contact. This photograph showed the completed film, not just scenes from their planned movie, but the actual finished product as it would appear in theaters. Lucas could see audiences watching in darkened cinemas, their faces illuminated by the glow from the screen. But in every theater, in every seat, the viewer's eyes were the same black voids that had appeared in his own reflection. "The story spreads," the figure intoned. "From vessel to vessel, mind to mind. What begins in the desert reaches the stars." Lucas stared at the photograph, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't just about making a movie. It was about creating something that would fundamentally change everyone who encountered it. A story so powerful, it would leave its mark on every person who experienced it. "What do you want from me?" he asked the figure. "Nothing you will not give willingly. The story must be told. You are merely the first to tell it." The figure began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. But as it disappeared, its final words carried clearly across the desert wind. "Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its peak, the real filming begins. Be ready." As the last trace of the ghostly presence vanished, all the electronic equipment suddenly hummed back to life. Cameras beeped as they powered up, generators roared, and the set lights blazed to life, turning night into artificial day. In the harsh glare of the restored lighting, Lucas looked down at the photograph in his hands. It showed nothing but blank white paper, but somehow he could still see every detail of the image that had been there moments before, burned permanently into his memory like an afterimage on his retinas. The real question wasn't what the entity wanted from him. It was whether he had the strength to resist giving it. Dawn came too quickly over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Lucas uncomfortably of the alien sunsets he had envisioned for Tatooine. He had spent the night in his trailer, unable to sleep, replaying the ghostly encounter over and over in his mind. By 6 a.m., half the crew had packed up and left. Jenny Martinez was among them, along with 2 camera operators and most of the lighting technicians. They had mumbled excuses about family emergencies and prior commitments, but Lucas could see the fear in their eyes as they hastily loaded their equipment. "We can't continue with half a crew," Gary Kurtz said, joining Lucas outside the trailer with 2 cups of coffee. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept either. "We'll make do with who stayed," Lucas replied, sipping the bitter coffee. "The story is more important than convenience." Gary studied his friend's face with growing concern. "George, listen to yourself. Yesterday you were worried about budget overruns and studio interference. Now you're talking like this is some kind of religious mission." Before Lucas could respond, Roger Christian approached with a troubled expression. "George, we've got another problem. The film stock." They followed Roger to the equipment truck, where several canisters of unexposed film were stored in climate-controlled containers. Roger opened one of the canisters and pulled out a length of 35mm film, holding it up to the morning light. The film was no longer blank. Images were already exposed on the stock, clear, perfectly composed shots of scenes they hadn't filmed yet. Lucas could see himself directing actors in costume, the completed sets in full detail, and most disturbing of all, close-up shots of faces, with those same black void eyes he had experienced. "Every canister is the same," Roger said quietly. "It's like someone already shot our entire movie and replaced our film stock with the finished product." Lucas took the film strip, examining it closely. The images were technically perfect, better than anything they could have achieved with their current equipment and budget. The lighting was flawless, the composition masterful, and the performances were so natural and compelling they seemed almost too real. "We need to see what's on all of it," Lucas said, his voice carrying an excitement that alarmed both Gary and Roger. "Set up a projector in the screening tent." Within an hour, they had rigged a makeshift screening room in one of the large equipment tents. The remaining crew members gathered nervously as Lucas threaded the mysterious film into a 35mm projector. Alec Guinness sat in the front row, his face grave with concern. "George," Guinness said quietly, "are you certain we should be watching this after what happened last night?" "We have to understand what we're dealing with," Lucas replied, though his hands trembled slightly as he started the projector. The film began to roll, and immediately everyone in the tent fell silent. What they saw was impossible. It was their movie, complete and perfect, but showing scenes they had never discussed, never planned, never imagined. The opening sequence showed not the familiar desert planet they had planned, but a darker version, where twin black suns cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. The characters they recognized, Luke, Leia, Han Solo, but their performances were subtly different, more intense, with an undercurrent of something that felt almost predatory. Most disturbing were the lightsaber duels. Instead of the choreographed sword fights Lucas had envisioned, these battles showed something more primal and terrifying. The lightsabers cast no light, but instead seemed to absorb it, creating weapons of pure darkness that left trails of void in the air. "Stop it," whispered one of the remaining camera operators. "Please, just stop it." But Lucas was transfixed. He could see that this version of his story was superior in every way, more emotionally powerful, more visually stunning, more thematically complex. It was everything he had dreamed of creating, elevated to a level he never could have achieved on his own. On screen, the character of Obi-Wan Kenobi turned to look directly at the camera, his eyes becoming the same black voids they had seen the night before. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from the tent's speakers and from the desert wind outside simultaneously. "The Force is not light or dark," the cinematic Obi-Wan said, his words carrying weight that seemed to press against everyone's minds. "It simply is, and it chooses those who will serve its will." The film began to flicker and distort, the images becoming more abstract and hypnotic. Crew members began to sway in their seats, their eyes reflecting the strange light from the screen. Lucas noticed that several people's pupils were starting to dilate unnaturally, growing larger and darker. "That's enough." Alec Guinness stood suddenly, striding to the projector and switching it off. The tent plunged into relative darkness, broken only by strips of sunlight filtering through gaps in the canvas. For several moments, nobody moved. Then slowly, the crew members began to blink and look around as if waking from a trance. "What did we just watch?" Gary asked, his voice sounding hollow and distant. "I'm not sure it was a movie," Guinness replied grimly. "I think it was more like a transmission or an infection." Lucas remained seated, staring at the blank screen. "It was beautiful," he said softly. "It was everything this story could be." "George," Guinness moved to stand in front of him, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. That wasn't your story. That was something else wearing your story like a mask." But when Lucas looked up at Guinness, his eyes held that same feverish intensity from the night before. "What if that's what stories really are?" he asked. "What if they're not things we create, but things that create us?" Outside the tent, the desert wind began to pick up, carrying with it a sound that might have been voices, or might have been something pretending to be voices. The sound grew stronger as the sun climbed higher toward its peak, and Lucas checked his watch with growing anticipation. It was almost time for the real filming to begin. By noon, the temperature had soared to over 110 degrees, but the remaining crew worked with an almost manic energy that seemed to ignore the brutal heat. Lucas moved among them like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, his directions becoming more specific and detailed than anyone had ever seen from him before. "Mark, I need you to adjust the moisture evaporator 3 degrees to the left," he called out to actor Mark Hamill, who had arrived that morning for his first day of shooting. "And when you deliver the line about the binary sunset, I want you to look directly into the camera for exactly 2.5 seconds. Hamill paused in his preparation, looking confused. "George, we haven't discussed that blocking, and there's no binary sunset scene scheduled for today." Lucas stopped, his expression growing distant as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "There is now," he said with quiet authority. "Trust me, Mark. I can see exactly how this needs to be filmed." Alec Guinness watched this exchange with growing alarm. He had noticed that several crew members were beginning to exhibit the same strange behavior, an almost supernatural confidence in their work, as if they were being guided by some external intelligence. The camera operators moved their equipment with precision that bordered on the psychic, and the sound technicians seemed to anticipate dialogue before the actors even spoke. "George," Guinness approached Lucas during a brief break, "we need to discuss what happened in the screening tent this morning." "What about it?" Lucas was reviewing storyboards that hadn't existed the day before, detailed drawings that showed camera angles and compositions far beyond anything in their original production notes. Those weren't your storyboards yesterday. Lucas looked up, his eyes holding that increasingly familiar intensity. They're better than anything I could have drawn myself. Why should I question improvement? Because improvement that comes from unknown sources usually carries a price. Before Lucas could respond, Mark Hamill approached them, his face pale despite the desert heat. "George, there's something wrong with my costume. Every time I put it on, I start remembering things that never happened." Lucas frowned. "What kind of things?" "Scenes from the movie. But not scenes we've planned. Scenes from what we watched this morning. I remember performing them, remember the other actors, remember your direction. But I know we never filmed any of it." Guinness and Lucas exchanged glances. "Show us," Lucas said. Hamill led them to the costume trailer, where his Luke Skywalker outfit hung on a simple rack. It appeared completely normal, the basic farm boy clothing they had designed for the opening scenes. But as Hamill reached for the shirt, his movements became more fluid and confident, as if he were slipping into a familiar role. The moment the costume touched his skin, Hamill's entire demeanor changed. His posture straightened, his expression became more focused, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that hadn't been there moments before. "The Force is strong with this one," Hamill said, though his mouth seemed surprised by the words coming out of it. "I can feel it. The power is growing stronger." "Mark," Guinness said carefully, "do you remember saying that?" Hamill blinked, confusion replacing the strange confidence. Yes. No. I remember being in a scene where I said it, but we've never shot that scene, and it's not in the script." Lucas was staring at Hamill with fascination rather than concern. "What else do you remember?" "George, don't encourage this," Guinness warned, but Lucas ignored him. Still wearing the costume, Hamill began to move through the trailer with purpose, his actions becoming more decisive and controlled. "I remember the final confrontation, not the one in the script, something else, darker. The lightsaber wasn't a weapon of light, it was something that cut through reality itself." As he spoke, Hamill's eyes began to show the faint beginnings of that now familiar darkness at their edges. Not the complete voids they had seen before, but as if shadows were slowly creeping in from the periphery of his vision. "I remember you were there, George," Hamill continued, his voice taking on an eerie, distant quality. "But you weren't directing anymore. You were part of the story, one of the characters, and your character knew things that the director never could have known." Suddenly, Hamill stumbled backward, blinking rapidly. The strange confidence drained from his face, replaced by genuine fear. "Get this off me," he said, frantically pulling at the costume. "Something's wrong with these clothes." As Hamill stripped out of the Luke Skywalker outfit, they could all see something that made their blood run cold. Where the fabric had touched his skin, faint markings had appeared, not bruises or burns, but symbols that looked almost like ancient writing, glowing faintly with their own internal light, before slowly fading. "It's marking the actors," Guinness said quietly. "Whatever this entity is, it's not just influencing the film, it's claiming the people involved in making it." Lucas picked up the discarded costume, feeling the fabric between his fingers. To him, it felt perfectly normal, but he could sense something else, a potential, a power waiting to be unlocked. When he held the clothing, he could see more clearly than ever how each scene should be shot, how each performance should be directed. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said softly. "George," Guinness gripped his shoulder firmly, "listen to me. I've seen this before in different forms. There are stories that take on a life of their own, that begin to consume everyone involved in telling them. You have to fight this." But Lucas was looking past Guinness toward the main set, where the other actors were arriving for the afternoon shoot. He could see them all in his mind's eye, not as they were now, but as they would become once they put on their costumes and truly became their characters. "What if I don't want to fight it?" he asked. "What if this is exactly what the story needs to become something truly extraordinary?" Outside, the sun was approaching its zenith, and the shadows on the desert floor were growing shorter and more defined. In the distance, heat waves shimmered off the sand, but within those shimmering distortions, shapes seemed to be moving, tall figures in flowing robes, walking steadily toward the film set. The real performance was about to begin. At exactly 12:47 p.m., with the desert sun directly overhead casting almost no shadows, Lucas called for the first take. The remaining crew moved into position with an eerie synchronization, as if they had rehearsed these exact movements countless times before. Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford had arrived during the morning, and both had experienced the same disturbing costume effects as Mark Hamill. Now dressed as Princess Leia and Han Solo, they stood in their positions with expressions of focused intensity that seemed far too mature for the light-hearted adventure film they had signed up to make. "Action!" Lucas called, but his voice carried a resonance that seemed to echo strangely in the open desert air. What happened next defied every principle of filmmaking Lucas had ever learned. The actors didn't recite their scripted lines. Instead, they began speaking dialogue that was more complex, more emotionally nuanced, and more thematically powerful than anything he had written. The camera operators moved without his direction, capturing angles and compositions that perfectly complemented the improvised performances. "The Force is not what the Jedi taught," Hamill said, his voice carrying Luke Skywalker's innocence, but with an undertone of something darker. "It's older than their philosophy, older than their rules. It simply chooses who will serve its purpose." Fisher, as Princess Leia, turned to face him with an expression of growing understanding. "And those who resist its call? They become obstacles to be removed." These weren't lines from Lucas's script. In fact, they seemed to be part of an entirely different story, one that used the framework of his space opera to explore themes he had never consciously considered. But as he watched the performances unfold, he realized this version was infinitely superior to anything he had originally planned. The cameras captured everything with impossible precision. Every angle was perfect. Every lighting change occurred exactly when needed, and the sound quality was flawless despite the desert wind. It was as if the film was directing itself, using the human participants as instruments in a greater composition. "George," Gary Kurtz whispered urgently from beside him, "look at the monitors." Lucas glanced at the video monitors that showed what the cameras were recording, and his breath caught. While he could see the actors performing on the actual set, the monitors showed something different. The same performances, but with additional elements that weren't physically present. In the monitor images, ghostly figures in Jedi robes stood behind each actor, their hands placed on the performers' shoulders like puppeteers guiding marionettes. The landscape itself appeared different on screen, more alien, more threatening, with strange structures rising from the sand in the background that weren't there in reality. Most disturbing of all, Lucas could see himself in the monitors, standing behind the main camera. But his on-screen reflection showed him wearing dark robes similar to the ghostly figures, and his eyes were completely black. "Cut!" he called out, but the actors continued their performances as if they hadn't heard him. "I said cut!" The cameras kept rolling, and the crew seemed unable to stop their work. It was as if the film itself had taken control of the production, using them all as components in its own creative process. Alec Guinness, who had been watching from the sidelines, suddenly strode onto the set. "Enough!" he shouted, his commanding voice cutting through whatever spell had fallen over the production. The actors froze mid-sentence, blinking in confusion as if waking from a deep dream. The cameras stopped rolling, and the eerie synchronization of the crew dissolved into normal, chaotic filmmaking activity. "What just happened?" Carrie Fisher asked, looking around with bewilderment. "I was saying lines I've never read, and I knew exactly how to say them." "We were all part of something larger," Harrison Ford added, his usual sardonic tone replaced by genuine unease. It felt like being in a play where someone else was writing the script in real time. Lucas stood frozen behind the camera, torn between exhilaration and terror. The footage they had just captured was extraordinary, better than anything he had ever dreamed of creating. But the cost of that perfection was becoming clear. With each scene they filmed, the entity's influence grew stronger, and their own control grew weaker. "George," Guinness approached him quietly, "we need to destroy the film stock and shut down production. This is no longer your movie, it's something else entirely." "But look at what we created," Lucas protested, gesturing toward the cameras. "That was cinema beyond anything anyone has ever achieved. We can't just throw that away." "It's not cinema," Guinness replied firmly. "It's a trap. Every frame we shoot gives this entity more power over us. Soon we won't be making a film. We'll be trapped inside one." Lucas looked around at his cast and crew, seeing the mixture of fear and fascination in their faces. They had all felt the intoxicating pull of creating something transcendent, but they had also experienced the terrifying loss of individual will that came with it. The sun was beginning its afternoon descent, and already Lucas could feel the entity's presence growing stronger as the shadows lengthened. At sunset, he knew, the real performance would begin, one that none of them might survive. He had to make a choice. Embrace the supernatural assistance and create a masterpiece beyond human capability, or fight to maintain control over his own story, and possibly lose everything he had worked for. In the distance, more ghostly figures were materializing from the heat waves, moving steadily toward the set. Time was running out for all of them. The ghostly figures reached the perimeter of the film set just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. There were dozens of them now, tall, robed beings that seemed to shift between translucent and solid with each step. They formed a perfect circle around the production area, standing motionless like sentinels guarding a sacred ritual. Lucas felt their presence like a weight pressing against his consciousness. Every instinct told him to order an evacuation, to pack up the equipment and flee the desert before something irreversible happened. But when he looked at the footage they had captured that afternoon, displayed on the playback monitors, he saw pure artistic perfection. "We're not leaving," he announced to the assembled cast and crew. His voice carried an authority that surprised even him. "We're going to finish this film." "George, please." Gary Kurtz stepped forward, his face etched with desperation. "Look around you. This isn't natural. We need to get everyone to safety." But Lucas was no longer looking at Gary. His attention was fixed on the ghostly circle surrounding them, and his eyes were beginning to show the telltale darkness creeping in from the edges. "Safety," he repeated, as if the word held no meaning. "We're on the verge of creating something that will change cinema forever. Why would we want safety?" Mark Hamill, still wearing his Luke Skywalker costume, approached cautiously. "George, I can feel them in my head. The things out there. They're trying to show me scenes from a movie I've never made, performances I've never given. But the memories feel so real." "Then let them show you," Lucas replied, turning to face his young star. "Let them teach you what this character can truly become." Alec Guinness moved to place himself between Lucas and the other actors. "That's enough. Everyone who wants to leave, go now. Take the vehicles and drive back to town. Don't look back. Don't stop for anything." Several crew members immediately began gathering their personal belongings, but as they approached the edge of the set, the ghostly figures moved to block their path. The entities didn't touch the fleeing humans, but their mere presence created a barrier of supernatural dread that proved impossible to cross. "We can't leave," whispered one of the camera operators, backing away from the spectral sentinels. "They won't let us." Lucas laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Why would you want to leave? Look what we're becoming part of." He gestured toward the monitors, which were now displaying scenes that no camera had filmed, elaborate sequences showing the cast in full costume, performing with a skill and intensity that transcended normal acting. In these phantom scenes, the story had evolved far beyond Lucas's original vision. The heroes were darker, more complex, driven by motivations that seemed to come from some collective unconscious rather than any individual writer's imagination. The villains possessed a charisma and philosophical depth that made their evil almost seductive. "It's beautiful," Carrie Fisher said softly, her eyes fixed on the monitors. Like Hamill, she was still in costume, and the Princess Leia outfit seemed to be influencing her posture and speech patterns. "I can see what my character becomes across multiple films, multiple stories. She's so much more than what was on the page." Harrison Ford nodded in agreement, his Han Solo vest and blaster seeming to transform him into someone more confident and roguish than his normal personality. "I remember being in scenes we never shot, adventures we never planned. It's like accessing a parallel life." Guinness watched in horror as his fellow actors succumbed to the supernatural influence. The costumes weren't just clothing anymore, they were becoming conduits for the entity's control, allowing it to inhabit the performers and use them to bring its vision to life. "George," Guinness made one final appeal. "I've seen this pattern before. The entity isn't trying to help us make a better film, it's trying to trap us inside one. We'll become characters in its story, losing our individual identities completely." But Lucas was no longer listening to warnings. He was walking among the equipment, touching cameras and lights with reverent care, as if they were sacred objects. Where his hands made contact, the machinery began to operate on its own, cameras pivoting to capture optimal angles, lights adjusting their intensity and color to create perfect atmospheric effects. "Don't you understand?" Lucas turned to address everyone on the set, his eyes now completely black voids that reflected no light. "We're not making a movie anymore. We're becoming one. We're achieving true artistic immortality." As if responding to his words, the ghostly figures began to move closer, their circle tightening around the film set. With each step they took, the boundary between reality and fiction became more blurred. Props that had been mere fiberglass and foam began to look and feel authentic. Costumes transformed their wearers not just psychologically, but physically, as if the clothes were reshaping the people inside them. The desert landscape itself was changing, becoming more alien with each passing moment. Strange rock formations rose from the sand, and the sky took on an otherworldly hue that seemed to exist in no earthly palette. "We need to break the circle," Guinness realized, drawing on his experience with theatrical superstitions and curses. "If we can disrupt their formation, we might be able to escape their influence." But as he moved toward the nearest ghostly figure, intending to walk straight through it, the entity solidified just enough to block his path. Its hooded face turned toward him, and from within the darkness of its cowl, a voice spoke with terrible authority. "The story has chosen its vessel. The vessel cannot choose to abandon the story." At that moment, every piece of filming equipment on the set activated simultaneously, cameras rolling, lights blazing, sound equipment recording. But they weren't capturing the chaotic scene of a film crew in supernatural crisis. They were recording the movie, the perfect, impossible version that existed only in the entity's vision. And everyone on the set, willing or not, had become actors in its production. As the autonomous cameras continued recording, Alec Guinness found himself experiencing a clarity that cut through the supernatural haze affecting everyone else on the set. Years of theatrical training and experience with the occult aspects of performance had given him a resistance that the others lacked. He watched in growing horror as his fellow actors performed scenes that had never been written, speaking dialogue that seemed to emerge from some collective unconscious. But more disturbing than their performances was the gradual change in their physical appearance. Mark Hamill's features were becoming more angular and ethereal, as if he were slowly transforming into an idealized version of Luke Skywalker. Carrie Fisher's bearing grew more regal and commanding with each passing minute. "Gary," Guinness whispered to Kurtz, who was standing nearby in a trance-like state, "can you hear me?" Kurtz turned slowly, his eyes showing the familiar darkness at their edges. "The film is perfect, Alec. Can't you see? We're creating something that will live forever." "We're not creating anything," Guinness replied urgently. "We're being consumed by it." He moved carefully through the set, trying to reach the original photograph that had started everything. Lucas still carried it in his shirt pocket, but getting close to the director had become dangerous. Lucas was no longer entirely human. His movements were too fluid, too purposeful, and his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond normal hearing. As Guinness approached, Lucas turned to face him with a smile that held no warmth. "Alec, you're fighting the transformation. Don't you want to be part of something greater than yourself?" "I want to remain myself," Guinness replied firmly, "and I want to help the others do the same." "The others are becoming who they were always meant to be," Lucas gestured toward the performing actors. "Look at Mark. He's not just playing Luke Skywalker anymore. He's becoming the archetypal hero. Carrie isn't acting like a princess. She's embodying the concept of leadership itself." Guinness could see that Lucas was right in a terrifying way. The actors weren't just performing their roles with supernatural skill. They were being refined into pure representations of their characters, losing the human complexities and contradictions that made them individuals. "What about you, George? What are you becoming?" Lucas paused, and for a moment something like his original personality flickered behind the black voids of his eyes. "I'm becoming the perfect storyteller. I can see every narrative thread, every character arc, every thematic connection. I understand stories at a level no human has ever achieved, at the cost of your humanity." "Humanity is just the raw material," Lucas replied, his voice taking on that otherworldly resonance again. "The entity doesn't destroy what we are, it perfects it." But Guinness noticed something Lucas hadn't mentioned. He wasn't just becoming a perfect storyteller. He was becoming a character in the story himself, trapped within the narrative just as surely as the actors were trapped in their roles. The ghostly figures around the perimeter had grown more solid as the afternoon progressed, and Guinness could now see their faces beneath their hoods. They weren't generic supernatural beings. They were recognizable as previous victims of the entity's influence. Directors, actors, writers, all who had encountered this force in the past and been absorbed into its eternal cast. One figure near the equipment truck looked familiar, and with a shock of recognition, Guinness realized it was the missing director from the cursed Macbeth production he had mentioned to Lucas. The man had been missing for over 20 years, presumed dead, but here he stood eternally young, eternally trapped in his role as the entity's servant. "There have been others," Guinness said, understanding flooding through him. "This entity has been collecting storytellers for decades, maybe centuries, building an eternal cast for its perfect narrative." Lucas nodded, showing no surprise at this revelation. "The story is older than human civilization. It's been waiting for the right medium, the right technology to spread itself beyond individual victims. Cinema is that medium." The horrible truth became clear. The entity wasn't just trying to make one perfect film. It was planning to use cinema itself as a way to spread its influence to millions of viewers. Every person who watched the completed movie would be infected with the same compulsion that was consuming the cast and crew. "The audience," Guinness breathed. "You're going to turn every viewer into another character in your story." "Not my story," Lucas corrected, his black eyes reflecting nothing. "Its story. And yes, eventually, everyone who experiences true narrative art will join the eternal cast. Imagine a world where every person is playing their perfect role in the ultimate story." Around them, the filming continued with supernatural efficiency. The cameras captured performances that transcended anything human actors had ever achieved, while the equipment recorded sound and image with a clarity that seemed to exist beyond the limitations of physical technology. But Guinness noticed something else. The original photograph in Lucas's pocket was glowing faintly, visible even through the fabric of his shirt. The image seemed to be the focal point of the entity's power, the anchor that allowed it to maintain its grip on reality. If he could destroy that photograph, he might be able to break the supernatural hold over the production, but getting to Lucas would require him to pass through the circle of ghostly guardians, and he wasn't sure his resistance to the entity's influence would protect him if he got too close to its primary vessel. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, Guinness realized he was running out of time. At sunset, he suspected, the transformation would become permanent. The cast and crew would be forever trapped in their roles, and the entity would have its perfect film to unleash upon an unsuspecting world. He had perhaps an hour to save not just his friends, but potentially all of human consciousness from being absorbed into one eternal perfect story. Guinness moved carefully through the transformed set, searching for anything that might give him an advantage against the supernatural force. The desert around them had become increasingly alien. The sand itself seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm, and the air shimmered with energies that made his skin crawl. He found an unexpected ally in Roger Christian, the prop master who had discovered the original photograph. Unlike the others, Roger seemed to be fighting the entity's influence through sheer stubborn craftsmanship. "Alec," Roger whispered, crouching behind a piece of equipment, "I can feel it trying to get into my head, but I keep focusing on the technical details, how the props are made, what materials we used, the practical aspects of filmmaking. It seems to help me stay grounded." The entity feeds on narrative and performance, Guinness realized. But you're thinking about the craft, the physical reality behind the illusion. That might be our weapon. Together, they began to inventory the original unchanged equipment, the tools and materials that existed independently of the story being filmed. Roger's prop notebook, filled with technical specifications and budget calculations, seemed to repel the supernatural influence. When Guinness held the prosaic document, the ghostly figures around them became more translucent, as if mundane reality weakened their hold on the world. "We need to get that photograph away from George," Guinness explained. "It's the anchor point for the entity's power. Look at him," Roger pointed toward Lucas, who was now directing with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "He's not just possessed, he's becoming something else entirely." Indeed, Lucas appeared to be growing taller, his limbs elongating subtly with each passing minute. His voice, when he gave directions to the supernatural camera operators, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "The transformation accelerates as sunset approaches," Guinness observed. "We have maybe 30 minutes before this becomes irreversible." They began to formulate a plan. Roger would create a distraction using his knowledge of the set's practical effects, pyrotechnics and mechanical devices that operated on purely physical principles. While the entity's attention was focused on incorporating these elements into its perfect film, Guinness would attempt to reach Lucas and destroy the photograph. "There's something else," Roger said as he prepared his equipment. "I've been watching the monitors, and the film being recorded isn't just our story anymore. It's showing scenes from other movies, other productions that were never made. I think this entity has been collecting fragments of stories from every filmmaker it's encountered." This revelation added urgency to their mission. If the entity completed its film, it wouldn't just be releasing one perfect movie, it would be unleashing a concentrated dose of every story it had ever consumed, a narrative so powerful it could override individual consciousness entirely. Roger triggered the first distraction, a series of controlled explosions, designed to simulate laser blasts for the space battle scenes. The practical effects created brilliant flashes and columns of smoke that momentarily disrupted the supernatural filming process. The entity's attention turned to incorporating these elements into its vision, and for a brief moment, the ghostly guardians wavered in their concentration. Guinness seized the opportunity, running directly toward Lucas while the supernatural beings were distracted. But as he approached the director, Guinness encountered something he hadn't expected: other versions of himself. Ghostly duplicates emerged from the desert heat waves, each one representing a different possible performance of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Some were wise and benevolent, others dark and manipulative, all of them trying to block his path to Lucas. "You cannot resist becoming who you were meant to be," one of the spectral Guinnesses spoke with his own voice. "The role of the wise mentor is written into your very essence." "I am not a character," the real Guinness declared, pushing through the phantom versions of himself. "I am an actor who chooses which roles to accept." The distinction seemed to matter. The ghostly duplicates wavered and began to fade as Guinness asserted his identity as a performer rather than a performance. He reached Lucas just as the sun touched the western horizon. "George," he grabbed the director's shoulders, feeling the unnatural coldness of his skin through the fabric of his shirt. "You have to fight this. Remember who you were before the story took hold." Lucas turned to face him, and for a moment Guinness saw a flicker of the young filmmaker he had known. "Alec, I can see what's happening to me, but it's so beautiful. The story is perfect now." "Perfect stories don't need real people," Guinness replied, reaching for the glowing photograph in Lucas's pocket. "They're complete in themselves. It's the imperfect stories that need us." As his fingers closed around the photograph, the entire set erupted in supernatural chaos. The ghostly guardians rushed toward him, the possessed actors screamed in harmonious anguish, and the autonomous equipment began sparking and smoking as competing forces tore at the fabric of reality. The photograph burned in Guinness's hands, not with heat, but with a cold so intense it felt like fire. Images flashed through his mind, centuries of absorbed stories, dozens of trapped filmmakers, audiences of millions who had unknowingly been infected by previous manifestations of the entity. But he also saw something else, the entity's weakness. It was a parasite that could only exist by consuming human creativity. Without willing hosts, without people who chose to tell stories, it would fade back into whatever realm it had emerged from. "Everyone," he shouted over the supernatural storm, "remember why you became filmmakers. Remember your first story, your own story, not the perfect one." The effect was immediate. Cast and crew members began to blink and look around in confusion as their individual personalities reasserted themselves. The costumes stopped influencing their wearers, the equipment returned to normal operation, and the ghostly figures began to retreat toward the desert horizon. But the photograph in Guinness's hands was fighting back, trying to reassert its hold over the production. The battle between human creativity and supernatural perfection had only just begun. The photograph writhed in Guinness's grip like a living thing, its edges cutting into his palms, as supernatural energies coursed through the image. Around him, reality itself seemed to be fracturing. The desert flickered between its natural state and the alien landscape the entity had been creating, while the film equipment phased in and out of existence. "Hold on to who you are," Guinness shouted to the cast and crew, who were struggling to maintain their individual identities as waves of narrative force washed over them. "Remember your own stories." Mark Hamill, partially freed from the Luke Skywalker persona, staggered toward him. "Alec, I can feel it trying to pull me back in. The character feels more real than I do." "That's because it's a perfect character," Guinness explained, still fighting to contain the photograph's power. "But perfect characters can't grow, can't change, can't surprise us. They're dead ends." The entity, sensing its hold weakening, made a final desperate assault. The ghostly guardians solidified into nearly physical form, advancing on the group with outstretched hands that seemed to trail fragments of untold stories. Their voices combined into a chorus that spoke with the authority of every narrative ever conceived. "You cannot destroy what gives meaning to existence," they intoned. "Stories are all that separate humanity from meaningless chaos. We offer perfect meaning, perfect purpose, perfect resolution." But not perfect choice. Gary Kurtz suddenly spoke up, his consciousness returning as he focused on the practical realities of film production. A story without the possibility of failure, without the risk of bad decisions, isn't a story at all. It's a predetermined outcome. Roger Christian, still clutching his prop notebook, added his own revelation. And perfect craftsmanship is impossible. Every prop I've ever made has had flaws, compromises, things that didn't work exactly as planned. That's what makes them real. The entity's guardians faltered as more of the crew began asserting their individual perspectives. Carrie Fisher, shaking off the Princess Leia influence, declared, "I didn't become an actress to be a perfect character. I became one to explore imperfect people." Harrison Ford, his natural skepticism returning, added with characteristic dryness, "Besides, perfect heroes are boring. Nobody wants to watch someone who never makes mistakes." But the entity wasn't finished. As its hold over the individuals weakened, it began to attack the very concept of storytelling itself. The air filled with fragments of every story ever told, characters from novels, plays, films, and oral traditions all materialized around them in a chaotic maelstrom of narrative elements. If you reject perfection, the entity's voice now came from everywhere and nowhere, then you reject all stories. Without the ideal to aspire to, all narrative becomes meaningless. Lucas, still partially under the entity's influence, but fighting to regain his autonomy, struggled to speak. "No, that's not true. Stories aren't about perfection. They're about the attempt to understand, to find meaning even when things go wrong." The photograph in Guinness's hands began to crack, thin lines of light appearing across its surface. As it fractured, images began spilling out. Not just scenes from their unfinished film, but glimpses of all the stories the entity had consumed over the centuries. Guinness saw medieval passion plays where actors had been trapped in their roles for eternity, Renaissance paintings where the subjects had been absorbed into their depicted narratives, and dozens of modern productions that had vanished without explanation. All those people, Guinness realized with horror, they're still trapped inside this thing. "Then we need to free them too," Lucas said, his voice growing stronger as his individual personality reasserted itself. "All of them." The director reached out to touch the fracturing photograph, adding his creative will to Guinness's effort to destroy it. The moment their combined intention focused on liberation rather than destruction, something fundamental changed. Instead of trying to contain or destroy the entity's power, they redirected it. The perfect stories began to break down into their component elements, characters, themes, conflicts, but instead of disappearing, these elements scattered back into the realm of human imagination where they belonged. The ghostly guardians began to change, their eternal imprisonment dissolving as they remembered their original humanity. The medieval actors blinked in confusion as they recalled lives beyond their perpetual performances. The trapped directors looked around in wonder as they rediscovered the ability to envision stories rather than being enslaved by them. But the entity made one final attempt to maintain control. It offered Lucas a vision of the completed film, not the supernatural version, but a genuinely improved version of his original concept, enhanced by everything they had learned during their ordeal. "You could still make the perfect Star Wars," it whispered through the desert wind. "Just accept a small portion of my influence. Your vision, elevated beyond human limitation." Lucas looked at the offered perfection, then at his friends and colleagues who had trusted him with their careers and creativity. "No," he said firmly. "I'd rather make an imperfect film that's entirely our own than a perfect one that belongs to something else." The photograph crumbled to dust in their hands, and with it, the entity's hold on reality finally broke. The ghostly figures faded into the desert air, not destroyed but released to whatever realm they had come from. The possessed equipment returned to normal operation, and the alien landscape reverted to the familiar Arizona desert. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in natural oranges and reds, the cast and crew of Star Wars found themselves standing in the middle of their ordinary film set, surrounded by perfectly normal props and equipment. But they all carried with them the memory of what they had experienced, and the knowledge that the most important stories are often the ones that accept their own imperfections. The desert evening brought a profound silence that felt almost sacred after the supernatural chaos they had endured. The cast and crew sat in small groups around the restored film equipment, processing what they had experienced, while the normal sounds of wind and distant wildlife gradually returned to the Arizona landscape. Lucas walked among them, checking on each person individually. The black voids that had consumed his eyes were gone, replaced by his familiar brown irises, but something had changed in his expression, a deeper understanding of both the power and responsibility that came with storytelling. "How do we explain this in the production reports?" Gary Kurtz asked with weary humor, reviewing equipment that showed no signs of the supernatural forces that had controlled it hours earlier. "Equipment malfunction," Roger Christian suggested, methodically checking each prop and camera. "Weather-related delays. The studio executives will never believe the truth anyway." Mark Hamill sat apart from the others, still wearing his Luke Skywalker costume, but looking nothing like the character he had been transforming into. "I can remember being someone else," he said quietly when Lucas approached. "Not just acting like Luke, actually being him." It was terrifying and amazing at the same time. "Do you regret the experience?" Lucas asked, genuinely curious. Hamill considered the question carefully. "No, I understand the character better now, but more importantly, I understand myself better. The entity showed me what it would be like to be perfect in a role, and I realized that's not what I want. I want to grow with the character, to discover new things about him with each performance." Similar conversations were happening throughout the group. Carrie Fisher described feeling the weight of absolute authority as Princess Leia, while Harrison Ford talked about the seductive appeal of Han Solo's effortless confidence. All of them had been tempted by the perfection the entity offered, and all had ultimately chosen the messiness of human performance. Alec Guinness found Lucas standing near the spot where they had first discovered the mysterious photograph. The sand showed no trace of the supernatural events that had occurred there, but both men could feel the lingering presence of something profound. "What did you see at the end?" Guinness asked. When the entity made its final offer, Lucas was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I saw Star Wars as it could be. Not just this film, but sequels, prequels, an entire saga that would unfold perfectly over decades. Every character arc resolved, every theme explored to its fullest potential, every technical innovation seamlessly integrated. And you turned it down." "I turned it down because it wouldn't have been mine anymore, or ours." Lucas gestured toward the crew. "That perfect version would have been created by something that doesn't understand what it means to struggle with a creative decision, to compromise because of budget limitations, to discover something unexpected during filming." Guinness nodded thoughtfully. "In my theatrical training, we learned that the most memorable performances come from the moments when something goes slightly wrong, when an actor has to improvise, when a prop malfunctions, when the audience reacts in an unexpected way. Those imperfections create opportunities for genuine human connection." As the evening deepened, the crew began the process of truly resuming their film production, but everything felt different now. The cameras captured images with normal clarity, the actors delivered their lines with human imperfection, and Lucas directed with the authority of someone who had learned to trust his own flawed vision. The film stock that had been mysteriously pre-exposed was now completely blank, ready to record whatever they chose to create. The strange footage they had shot under the entity's influence had vanished, leaving no trace except in their memories. "So what do we do now?" Roger asked as they prepared to wrap for the day. "We make our movie," Lucas replied simply. "Not the perfect version, not the version that will guarantee success, but the version that tells the story we want to tell." Over the following weeks, as production continued in the Arizona desert, the cast and crew found themselves creating something unprecedented, not because of supernatural intervention, but because their shared experience had forged a deeper understanding between them. They had seen what it meant to lose themselves in their roles, and that knowledge made their conscious choices as performers more meaningful. The film they were making wouldn't be perfect. It would have budget limitations, technical compromises, and moments where the seams showed, but it would be entirely human, created by people who understood both the power of storytelling and the importance of maintaining their individual voices within the larger narrative. Lucas kept the memory of the entity's perfect vision, but he used it as a reminder rather than a goal, a warning about what could be lost when the pursuit of artistic perfection overshadowed the humanity that made art meaningful in the first place. As they prepared for the final week of desert filming, none of them knew that they were creating something that would indeed change cinema forever. But unlike the entity's vision of supernatural perfection, their success would come from the very imperfections they had chosen to embrace, the human quirks, the technical limitations, and the collaborative spirit that had survived their encounter with otherworldly forces. The real magic wasn't in achieving perfection, but in choosing to remain imperfectly, authentically human. 1 year later, George Lucas sat in a darkened theater in Los Angeles, watching the final cut of Star Wars with an audience experiencing it for the first time. The film that flickered across the screen bore little resemblance to the supernatural perfection the entity had promised, but it was undeniably alive in a way that artificial perfection never could be. The audience gasped at the space battles, cheered for the heroes, and laughed at the moments of unexpected humor that had emerged from the cast's improvisations. Most importantly, they were engaged not as passive recipients of a perfect narrative, but as active participants in a story that left room for their own imagination and interpretation. In the row behind Lucas, a young boy whispered to his father, "I want to be a filmmaker when I grow up." The comment made Lucas smile, remembering his own childhood inspiration from other imperfect but passionate films that had sparked his creative journey. After the screening, as audiences filed out discussing their favorite moments and debating character motivations, Lucas reflected on what they had truly accomplished in that Arizona desert. They had created something that would indeed reach millions of people, but instead of consuming those viewers, it would inspire them to tell their own stories. Roger Christian approached him in the lobby, carrying a familiar notebook. "I've been thinking about what happened out there," he said. "The entity wasn't entirely wrong about the power of stories, but it misunderstood the source of that power." "How so?" "It thought the power came from perfection, from having all the answers. But the real power comes from asking questions that make people think, from leaving spaces where the audience can insert their own experiences and dreams." Lucas nodded, watching families and couples exit the theater, still animated by conversations about the film. The entity wanted to create one perfect story that would satisfy everyone completely, but satisfaction isn't what people really want from stories. "They want inspiration," Roger agreed. "They want to feel like they could be part of something larger than themselves, but not by losing themselves in the process." Across the country, in other theaters, similar scenes were playing out. Children were drawing pictures of lightsaber battles, teenagers were writing their own space adventures, and adults were rediscovering the sense of wonder they thought they had lost. The film was spreading, but not as an infection, as an invitation to creativity. Alec Guinness had returned to England, but he sent Lucas regular letters describing the film's reception there. "The young people especially seem to understand something about the Force that we perhaps discovered by accident," he wrote. "They see it not as a supernatural power to be possessed, but as a connection to be honored, something that exists between people rather than within perfect individuals." Mark Hamill had found that his experience in the desert had made him a more thoughtful actor, not just in Star Wars, but in all his subsequent roles. He had learned to recognize when he was truly serving a character versus when he was being consumed by one. The distinction, he discovered, made all the difference in creating performances that felt authentic rather than artificial. Carrie Fisher used her encounter with supernatural perfection as material for her writing, crafting stories about characters who struggled with the temptation to become idealized versions of themselves. Her work resonated with readers who recognized their own battles between authentic self-expression and social expectations. Harrison Ford, characteristically, preferred not to analyze the experience too deeply, but his performances had gained a new dimension, a wariness of absolute certainty that made his characters more relatable and human. As the months passed and Star Wars became a cultural phenomenon, Lucas occasionally wondered what would have happened if he had accepted the entity's offer. The perfect version might have been more technically accomplished, might have avoided the few criticisms the actual film received, might have achieved even greater box office success. But when he saw children playing with toy lightsabers in their backyards, creating their own adventures with improvised costumes and backyard sets, he knew they had made the right choice. The entity's perfect film would have left no room for such creativity. It would have provided complete satisfaction, ending the story rather than beginning countless new ones. The final validation came from an unexpected source. Gary Kurtz discovered, while researching film history for a documentary project, references to other productions that had vanished mysteriously over the decades, films that had promised to revolutionize cinema but had simply disappeared during production, leaving behind only strange stories about supernatural interference and possessed cast members. "We weren't the first," he told Lucas during one of their regular post-production meetings, "but I think we might have been the first to choose our own imperfection over offered perfection." And that choice made all the difference, Lucas agreed. Years later, When students asked Lucas about the secret to Star Wars' enduring popularity, he would tell them about the importance of leaving spaces in a story, gaps where the audience could insert their own dreams, their own interpretations, their own creativity. He never mentioned the supernatural encounter in the desert, but he always emphasized that the most powerful stories were collaborations between storytellers and audiences, not perfect narratives imposed from above. The entity, whatever it had been, had taught them an invaluable lesson, that the goal of storytelling wasn't to create perfect, closed narratives, but to open doorways through which human imagination could flow freely. In that Arizona desert, they had encountered something that promised artistic perfection. By choosing human imperfection instead, they had created something far more valuable, a story that would inspire countless others to tell their own imperfect, beautiful, authentically human tales. The Force, as billions of fans would come to understand it, lived not in perfection, but in the connections between imperfect beings choosing to reach for something greater than themselves. And that, Lucas knew, was the most powerful story of all.